Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What do we mean when we talk about social protection, especially for 4.5 billion of the 7.5 billion people around the world who do not have social protection? Today we're going to take a look at this very interesting concept and how it can apply to all of us and certainly to the vast majority of the people on the planet. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Isabel Ortiz. Ms. Ortiz is the Director of Social Protection at the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called the ILO. Ms. Isabel Ortiz, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Hello, Bill. Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. We've talked about the ILO many times in the past, but we always start off with a little overview of what exactly, when was the ILO formed? Why was it formed? What's its main mission?
The ILO was actually formed in 1919, nearly 100 years ago. It's the only agency of the United Nations that has survived the League of Nations and so long. And for all this period, for nearly these 100 years, the ILO has been working to ensure that labor and social protection and other topics relevant to work and employment are actually, on top of the national agendas. It is a tripartite organization, and that is unique. Its governing body actually is composed of governments, employers, and trade unions, and they all have equal voice.
Now, our viewers can go to your website at www.ilo.org to get more information about this really interesting and important UN agency. There's in the ILO world, there's this decent work agenda, but you also have 4 pillars that are really the undergirding of the organization and all of the work that you do. What are these 4 pillars and how do they tie into the decent work agenda?
Correct. The whole work of ILO is based on 4 main areas. These are jobs, employment generation, then social protection, which is the topic we are going to talk today and the one I direct. And then you have also fundamental labor standards, and then social dialogue. And social dialogue is actually essential to make all these policies work. And we will perhaps later on explain a bit more. It is by having a social dialogue at the national level between employers, governments, and trade unions that you can actually find optimal solutions to ensure that employment has adequate standards and social protection.
Now, when we all talk about social protection, what exactly do we mean? How do you define social protection?
It's a very good question. Social protection is actually a human right. It's part of the human rights like any other, like education, like health, and it's a sector. You see, all countries do have ministries of labor and social security. Social security was the old name of social protection, but with years it has been used, the name has been adapted. And generally covers a number of contingencies of risk that people suffer across the life cycle. So, during childhood, you are particularly vulnerable. At time of maternity, when you are in employment, you might fall unemployed, you may lose your job. You may have an accident and actually become disabled. And inevitably, all of us are going to become old and will need some pension or some support. So all this set of policies that provide support across the life cycle, generally through cash benefits or pensions, this is social protection.
And the conditions you were describing a moment ago, being unemployed, being in an accident, whatever, all of us can identify with at least one or maybe more of those. And certainly, if we live long enough, we'll all be going into old age. Well, your office came out with a very interesting report, the World Social Protection Report 2017-2019, Universal Social Protection to Achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. What exactly is that report about? What are some of the major findings and the conclusions?
Well, the report tries to monitor progress in social protection, and this is part of SDG 1. It's actually one of the indicators of that SDG, a Sustainable Development Goal, that all countries of the world agree to implement by 2030. This is what is called the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations. So part of this Goal 1 includes social protection. And the indicator actually measures how many people are covered by social protection, disaggregated by gender, and then looking at children, maternity, persons with disabilities, and older persons. So what the report does is collecting information from all countries of the world, and it has been a work of years, to get this information through the countries, to validate it, to engage with a dialogue with the statistical offices of the countries, and then finally putting it all together to understand what is the state of social protection in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought up SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 1. And of course, when we look back on the Sustainable Development Goals, just as background, these were adopted by, I guess in 2015,
Correct.
by all the members of the United Nations General Assembly, all 193 countries. And they were basically going to run from 2016 to 2030. There were 17 logical, sustainable, measurable goals to, as you mentioned in number 1, to eliminate poverty by 2050, to provide quality education, to provide meaningful jobs, labor, to combat climate change. And so these are so very, very important to focus on. And there are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands probably, of organizations around the world, even service clubs like Rotary International or Kiwanis International, different ones like that, are focusing on some groups on all of the 17 goals. Now you mentioned number 1 in particular. Are there other goals sustainable of those 17 that I know every one of them ties into what you're doing, but is there one or two more that are that you're looking at more so?
Yes, correct. The measuring progress on social protection serves for other goals, for instance, inequality. And social protection is a key policy to reduce poverty, which is goal number 1, but also inequality. And so is for the progress on health. So goal number 3 is also important. And then decent work, which is number 8. So there are a number of goals, but particularly, most specifically, this report is very useful to measure progress in SDG 1.3, which is the one that deals specifically on coverage and social protection.
Mm-hmm. And now is this report on the ILO.org website?
Yes,
you can
correct.
go there, or you can just Google it.
You can just Google it, and actually you have lots of materials there. You can download the graphs, the statistics, the data for your own work, to use it on research, and it is updated regularly. Actually, the information we're collecting, ILO started collecting it already in the 1950s, so it comes really back in time. Mm-hmm. But periodically, every number of years, then the information is updated to know how are we progressing. Mm-hmm. But this time specifically has been updated, so in a way that it's matched perfectly the Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. So it's useful for this exercise.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this is very timely now, and that's one of the great strengths of really the UN agencies around the world, the International Labor Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Children's Fund. Mm-hmm. They collect some of the best data in the world to help people look at these problems and to see where and to gauge how well we're doing in combating problems such as hunger, such as unemployment, such as malnutrition, whatever it may be. And of course, so many people rely upon the UN data. Well, let's take a look we'll dissect the report piece by piece by piece. So often when we think of social protection, we think of the more vulnerable. And of course, the one group that always pops up, especially in war zones or whatever, are children. You always talk about children. How does this report tie into looking at the plight of children, all around the world, not just in war zones, and looking at providing social protection for them?
Yes. Well, it looks at children and looks at the other groups that we thought, mothers that are, delivering, persons with disabilities, old age persons and others. But I think you need a number. You had to go from this interview with a number to remember. The number will be the overall aggregate that will look at all of them. And that the number is 45. That means 45% of the world population are covered by at least one social protection benefit. And this number is very important to remember because it shows that actually still half of the world population is not really covered. And then we can go into the details of each, so how is the number for children, how is the number for each of the other groups. So let's go for children. So for children, about 35% of children of the world are covered. And the differences between regions are massive. So what you find is in the high-income economies, particularly in Europe and some, Japan, they are generally covered, like totally. But so coverage is wide, is nearly 100. But then you, of course, see other regions and coverage is just not there. No? Mm-hmm. And in case of children, it's actually shows a huge underinvestment, because children are actually a huge amount of the global population, in millions, and they are actually very vulnerable, and a cash transfer can actually make a big difference in the life of a child. Cash transfer might make the difference between this child going to a school or having to work in the fields in rural areas. Mm-hmm. Might make the difference between this child being able to go to a doctor and receive treatment for whatever disease, or just be at home and have suffered the disease, and grow up less well. Particularly, it makes a lot of difference in nutrition. This little cash transfer that many families receive around the world, 35% of them, might make the difference between better nutrition or bad nutrition. Being able to eat some adequate diet, that will include some protein, some carbohydrate, or being malnourished, and then with significant deficiencies later on in life, because the impacts of malnourishment on children are actually very long term. An adult can pass a period of malnourishment and nothing happens, but a child, actually, this has impacts for life, so it's not reversible. So it's very important, actually, to support children. So, and we are at 35% of children covered. So it's a lot to do. And there are many agencies actually working towards that, particularly UNICEF, but also ILO, World Bank, and many others that are working towards ensuring that children do get this coverage that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. And now this social protection, this can be provided in many ways. Is that correct? You were talking about cash transfer, small amounts of money to help a family, maybe a subsistence level or something like that. But there are other things too, such as providing free schooling, or perhaps some type of food program, food nutrition program, subsidized lunches at school, things like that.
Correct.
That would all be included?
You mentioned them all, generally,
okay.
yes.
I didn't cover all of them, but...
well, no, the major ones. The
yeah.
major ones are those, free meals in schools. That's a very important type of programs. Also, food support, grants to study. These are the typical things that you also will get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has some type of intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very important, a very comprehensive concept, and that is social protection, and what can be done to help provide assistance to a large, if not all, people on planet Earth. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Isabel Ortiz. Ms. Isabel Ortiz is the Director of Social Protection at the United Nations International Labor Organization. We're talking about the children, and which is so important, obviously, because those are the formative years. If children are malnourished, if they don't receive proper education, if they're living in a war zone like Syria, their childhood could be literally erased just in a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. But they really are critical. But we also have men and women who are working. What types of services or what types of social protection can be provided to them, and especially in certain situations like maternity care or something like that?
Yes. Well, let's recapitulate. So the overall number of people that are covered around the world on social protection is 45%. So 45% of all the people of the world receive at least one social protection benefit. So it's a lot to be done. Half of the world still is not covered. Then we went through children, and now if we look at people in working age, men and women, there are some specific vulnerabilities that happen along the life of a working life of a person that are very important to sustain people in these moments of fragility. And this might be, for instance, the case of maternity. Any woman, no matter the income level, actually, they might be mothers, and then they need support because they might not be able to keep working during these months. And this great progress at global level, the figure is 41% of all mothers with newborns do receive social protection benefits. There will be cash transfer benefits, but there are other sets of benefits that are not in this number that are also important, like maternity leave, numbers of day leave that you get, and also parental leave overall, meaning the fathers, the parents, they also can take leave so to take care of the children. And this is being expanded now along high income and middle income countries. You will find many countries that actually are increasing paternity leave too, which is an important development. Then you have, of course, the risk of losing your job, or have inadequate jobs, so you are poor and unable to meet your income, your household income that is needed. And that actually the figures here are quite bad. It's only about 22% of persons with unemployed persons receiving support. So it shows that the world needs to do a lot, on that end. And then there are other areas that are important, and perhaps more significantly is the issue of disabilities. So anybody, across the life cycle really can have an accident and become disabled, or being born disabled. So the number of people covered with severe disabilities is about 28% of the global population of persons with disabilities are actually receiving some type of support. This is a very low number considering the severity of the disabilities. So more needs to be done there.
We saw that the world was, economically speaking, was moving fairly well back until about 2007, 2008, and the United States blew up the economic system around the world. We had a collapse in this country. We were sitting on the brink of a depression, come right down to it.
Correct.
That was because the housing market was was overpriced in this country. There were bubbles, inflationary bubbles, and what have you. But we're starting to come back. It's been a gradual improvement. The economy in the United States has improved, really for the past 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years, has been going up. The rest of the world seems to be moving along too. But how is that affecting whether or not these services are expanding? Are they expanding, or are they contracting?
This is a very good question, and it actually has many aspects, because is recovery really happening? We should really question that. It is true that we are not as bad as it was in 2008, but we are still talking, the world is still talking about recovery, because it's not really happening. So there are signs of improvement, but not really a full recovery with adequate employment levels and sufficient economic activity as we could call it recovery. So in what it has happened, so in this period since 2010, what we have seen is a number of countries actually entering fiscal consolidation policies, most normally called austerity policies. This austerity trend that starts in 2010 actually is not only limited to Europe as people think. This is because in Europe, perhaps because trade unions are more vocal, and that it has gone to the streets and that. But actually these austerity measures are happening in a majority of developing countries too. So, and this is an interesting situation, because if we see progress in social protection over the decades, actually progress has been massive, you see. We had, since the 1900s to now, you see more and more countries had established systems of social protection that are universal in its essence, so intend to cover all the population. They have established social insurance, they have established also social assistance to protect those that cannot contribute to social insurance. So you see, it has been a massive expansion of social protection over the world. But just during this very recent period, it has been this short term adjustment. So actually a number of countries are cutting on the benefits. But this is a short-term adjustment. What is important for policymakers, and that's really very important, is that the short-term adjustments should not jeopardize the big progress achieved with time. The short-term adjustment needs to be, circumnavigated as you can, but then, you keep moving towards, towards the achievement of universal social protection for everybody, which is the agreement of the SDG 1.
That's very important, yes. Now, you were talking about the public investment, and we're talking about primarily governments and the public sector putting in, but they have public pensions, we also have private pensions too. What is the status of that? It seems like, I know in certain countries like the United States and some others, there has been an emphasis on trying to really weaken labor laws to some companies that said they were going to provide pensions for workers have gone out of business, or they sell their companies and they don't feel like they're obligated to provide these pension benefits. What is the situation with the private sector?
Okay, that leads us to the question of pensions, which is not just a public or private issue. It's actually how many people are covered, etc. So actually, pensions is the most developed of all the social protection benefits. And in terms historically, you see this generally one of the first type of schemes that gets done, and about 68% of all older persons, men and women, received some type of pension around the world. So you compare the different numbers I was giving before. 68% is enormous success. It means that the majority of older persons in the planet do receive, a pension, and overwhelmingly, these are public systems that take the responsibility to create a system of pensions that maybe have different components, but ensures income security when you are old. And but in the 1980s, it was a trend towards privatizing pensions. Now, why? This is a very interesting question. Why? Pensions move a lot of money. They are the long-term savings of people, and they become very attractive to private sector. So mostly fostered by the World Bank and by international financial organizations. Actually, there was a move towards privatizing public pensions. And it was a lot of fanfare, a lot of noise about that, and a lot of marketing of the fact. Despite all that, only 23 countries privatize the pensions. There are 182 countries in the world. So the reality is that very few countries really privatized. But most interestingly, in the recent years, what happens is that countries have been reversing the privatization of pensions and have been renationalizing, if you wish, or at least reversing these privatizations and turning back to public system. And why? Because it does not work. These private pensions, they work for those workers that have higher income, and they are kind of savings accounts, and they are invested. But they don't work for the whole society when you also have lower income earners and people that might have random jobs, and that they change a lot and that might have shorter contribution periods. So then what happens is that in countries where pensions were privatized, actually the state had to anyway provide public pensions for those that had more erratic incomes and others, and very much affected women, by the way. So it did not help to increase coverage. It did not help to have better pensions, and it was worse when the world crisis came in 2008. The majority of these pension funds actually lost lots of money because they were invested in stocks, etc. So it does not work. So that's why countries are overwhelmingly moving towards public systems again. And in recent years, a number of countries like Poland, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Bolivia, Argentina, they all reversed from private pensions to public pensions again.
Which is very important. If the first system doesn't work, go back to what you did before that does work. Well, this issue of social protection is so important, and it's something that affects everybody on the planet at some point in life, because as we mentioned earlier, somebody could be disabled, they could be unemployed, they could be on maternity leave, whatever the case might be. But it is a very important issue, and your report sounds fascinating. And I'm sure our viewers would like to go to www.ilo.org to learn more about not only this report, but also what the International Labor Organization is doing in many other areas. But Isabel Ortiz, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much to you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.